Welcome to Pioneer Mindset, a place where we challenge our mindset and address the discomfort in both business and life by finding clarity resulting in bold conviction. I'm your host, Garrett Ruskamp, fifth generation farmer, husband, and father from rural Nebraska. Whether you're navigating frustration from past decisions or worry about the uncertainty you face today in your business, we're going to learn from our struggles and take on new challenges with a resilient mindset. Join me as I share my journey of struggles I faced in agriculture as a farmer and family man. I'm ready to dive into honest conversations to tackle the mindsets surrounding key issues that rural ag business owners face that will ultimately help you gain control, leading to a profitable and sustainable business. Let's adapt to Pioneer Mindset and get to it. Welcome back, everyone. For this week's episode, I want to dive into this conversation on, say, in your operation, whether you should specialize or be diversified. And so, really the difference between those two is they're kind of polar opposite, right? We've got a lot of diversified operations, a lot of different income streams coming in, a lot of different avenues that we can go down. Or do you specialize? Do you really focus and hone in on one thing and kind of go that route? And so for me, kind of really talking to lots of different operations out there, in most cases, they're diversified. You look back at the operations that kind of came up, or maybe if you're a generational farm, look back at your past and the generations before you, most generally, they were probably diversified to some extent. And in most cases, the most common, diversified operations were, crops and livestock, right? So we could raise maybe lots of different types of livestock. I look back at, my family, for instance, and at one point in time, we had hogs, we had cattle, we had, dairy. So that way, and I'd say in those days, it was actually to the extent of just even raising the raw goods for yourself for consumption to, basically stay alive, right? And then you've got all these different crops that you raise for feed or to sell, and whatever that actually looks like. And so as I was actually thinking about this, I recently listened to a book, or in most cases people read them, but I like to listen to them. I was in the tractor, and so I listened to the book called Dirt Rich, Cash Poor by Brian Reisinger, and it was telling kind of their story from a Wisconsin farm. And so, the book itself, I could go into a whole different kind of episode talking about land rich, cash poor, dirt rich, cash poor. And so I think that's a whole different topic, but kind of at the end there, really talking about the importance of being diversified. Okay. So this got me thinking, okay, is it truly important for us to be diversified, or would it be better to specialize? And at the end of the day, just kind of cut to the chase here. And it really just depends on your operation, right? But I wanted to dive into this episode today because I think there's a lot of pros and cons that go with being diversified, but the same with being specialized. And so, like I mentioned before, they're kind of opposite of each other. So let's just kind of dive into this and see what this actually looks like, okay? So, when you talk about diversification today, because we could look back on the past, and that's ultimately where this thought process came from, is we look back at previous generations and how they got to where they are today. We think about which ones actually survived, which ones actually thrived, where people are at today, or, how they got to where they are today, And so, kind of thinking that route as far as where you're at today and where we go moving forward. Okay, what does this actually look like? Do we need to, I'd say in most cases, most operations have become very specialized, have really honed in on one thing that they think has really worked for them. Okay, and I think that's great. But as we look to move forward, right, as we look to go in the future and kind of focus on the future, is it going to be better to kind of go back to maybe some older ways where we are diversified? I don't necessarily know the answer to that, but ultimately at the end of the day, I'm here talking to you as you listen to this to present some different ideas and how as we think about this and really kind of challenge that mindset, right? Pioneer mindset. So that's ultimately what we're going to do. So let's kind of dive into this first, starting with diversification, the being diversified, what this actually looks like, and some different avenues and how people are diversified today, right? So pretty common, like I mentioned before, maybe you're in row crops, but you're diversified in the crops that you raise. Maybe you've got corn, soybeans, wheat, alfalfa, some other small grains. Maybe you're in an area where you've got, other value-added crops or something like that. Or so you've got some different small niches there that could be diversifying. Or in most cases, really common here where we've got livestock and crops, okay? So we've got, the farmer feeder, as most people will call it in our area. When we're in Cumming County, northeast Nebraska, that's where we're at. There's a lot of farmer feeders, as we call them. So basically they farm, they raise corn, and then they use that corn and they feed it to the cattle. You got farmer feeders. They feed the cattle, they farm, and then they feed. Okay, so that's very common. And also, basically same thing with the livestock. Back in the old days, we had a lot of people that had hogs. And so you raise the corn and you grind that and you feed that to the hogs, or you feed that to the cattle, or you raise alfalfa and feed that to the cows. And so there's a lot of different ways you could kind of go about there. Or maybe you've got some custom services. Maybe you've got a lot of equipment. So not only do you use that equipment for your own needs, but then you provide a service for others where you utilize your equipment for custom. So you're hired out in that regard. So there's that option. And so then another kind of couple things here is maybe it's direct to consumer. Maybe you're doing retail sales and trying to capture that, basically value added or that extra dollar back on what we're trying to sell here and raise. A lot of people going down that avenue right now. I mean, that could be a sense of diversification, right? And so then another thing that kind of comes to mind is similar to what I'm doing right now is maybe talking to a mic, doing a podcast, right? Doing something with maybe knowledge or expertise. Maybe it's some sort of consulting or different ways to diversify the income in that regard. Like I said, there's different avenues you kind of go down there. Maybe it's crop scouting or, different things like that. And so there's lots of ways that you could really consider diversification, but rather to keep it simple, it's basically diversifying your income streams, diversifying, rather than just say one thing that you're bringing income in from. This is multiple different income streams, enterprises, whatever that actually looks like. And so, when this comes down to this is farmers or ranchers that are involved in multiple types of enterprises, crops, or income streams, really, rather than relying on just one, it helps reduce that risk, increase resilience, and creates more financial stability, right? And so there's lots of things that are important there, lots of things that can really help us benefit this. So what are some of the pros as we talk about this? What are the pros that we want to talk about first, right? So, the big thing there is kind of protecting yourself from price drops or, fluctuations in the market from, say, one specific crop. That's kind of a big one there. If you're just raising corn on corn, you're going to be reliant on whatever that price is and whatever the weather is for that single crop as well. And the market changes and the supply and demand and whatever that actually looks like. Okay. So there's a lot of advantages to raising multiple crops because it kind of comes back to that resiliency and creating that financial stability, helping with maybe some cash flow. Kind of a good side note there is even if you're, say, a corn soybean operation, which is a big portion of our area here in the Midwest, is even if you add crops like alfalfa, or in our case, wheat, we raise corn, soybeans, wheat, and alfalfa. Just by adding wheat, we harvest that at a different time of year. We create income, basically midsummer if we sell it right away. And so that's providing a different timing of income, different source of income, different crop that's not necessarily reliant on the same weather patterns. Same thing for alfalfa. Alfalfa is kind of the same way. You could probably send that, sell that right out of the field if you needed to. So there's different ways to kind of manage that from just even a cropping standpoint. Okay. Now let's flip this to the most common diversification out there, which is crops and livestock. I'm going to talk specifically to like crops and cattle or beef cattle, because that's what I'm familiar with. That's what our operation is diversified in. Even though we don't actually say own the cattle anymore, the cows, we do have some custom grazing, some different avenues that way. So there again, that's another route of, say, diversification is maybe just not even owning this. We could do, say, the custom grazing, custom feeding, custom anything like that is a different realm or different kind of income stream, source, time, whatever that is. So that's another thing to kind of consider there when it comes to diversification, right? So back to this, when it comes to row crops and livestock, what are the pros there as well? A big one would be timing. A big one would be obviously the weather, the price fluctuations, the market, and the different things there. And in most cases, I think the reason people got into this might be because, or maybe labor standpoint, right? Well, so if you're a row crop operation, maybe this is kind of your 6 main months out of the year from April till September, October. But the rest of the year, you could be doing something else. You could be feeding cattle. You could be feeding hogs. You could be feeding something else or taking care of the cows. And so maybe that's that avenue, or the equipment wise, you can utilize multiple different pieces of equipment for the different avenues there. So there's an option there. Land based as well. And say you got cows and you want to graze those stocks in the fall time or something like that. So different ways to really kind of consider that. There's lots of reasons that people have gotten into that. And there's reasons that they've survived thus far and thrived. Okay. So when it comes to the diversification, lots of good benefits there. Now, I want to talk about the negatives. What are the negatives and why do people ultimately go away from diversification? Why do they go to specializing, say one particular income stream or really diving and honing this in? Okay. So what are the negatives specifically to say diversification? Well, for one, maybe you've got lack of focus. You've got multiple different things going on. You know how it is when you've got different income streams. Maybe you're trucking, maybe you've got a row crop operation, maybe you've got a feed yard. Lots of different things happening on. So your focus is in different areas. Which one of those do you actually push? Which one of those do you actually put the throttle down, or which ones do you pull back on? You don't necessarily know, right? And so that kind of comes down to the next case here would be is financial overextension, or maybe just having to invest in other things. So I just mentioned before, just literally about a couple minutes ago, about how if you have a diversified operation, you can utilize multiple pieces of equipment. Okay. Well, what's the inverse of that? Well, the inverse is, if I've got alfalfa, I need to have a baler, which is just for alfalfa, or a windrower just for alfalfa. Or if I'm into row crops, a planter just for those specific crops. Same thing for, say, cattle or livestock. Feed wagon, not necessarily going to do you a lot of good if you're trying to grow crops, right? So feed wagon is very specific there. Maybe it's a working chute, maybe it's a box scraper, some different things when it comes to the livestock side. So the equipment there is, yes, while there's a lot of crossover, there's a lot of equipment that needs to be very specific to that specific thing that you're doing, right? And so a lot of extra financial overhead and different things to consider there. Now, another thing here would be really hard to track the numbers, really hard to keep track of what's actually coming in and what's actually doing a lot of good here. This is ultimately the biggest downside that I see diversification, and the one that I've honed in on ourselves and within our own operation. Part of the reason that we actually sold our cows a while back, and if you paid attention to that, this is a big reason here, is because it's really hard to track the numbers. Okay, if you've got a diversified operation, multiple different income streams, enterprises, but say it's running all through, say, one bank account, you got one set of books, you got one set of, say, balance sheet, cash flow, those different things that we need to track, our financial progress, and if we're actually being profitable or not. That's the big thing, is we don't know what's actually profitable if we're tracking this all as one and we don't, say, separate this. And it's really hard to separate if you're running these things all through the same account. It's really hard to kind of come into the QuickBooks and say, I think this expense goes to the cows, or I think this expense goes to the crops. In some cases, we know exactly that, the planner payment, that goes exactly to the crops, right? And so I think, there's some cases it's not so bad, but in general, it's really hard to be specific. It's really hard to narrow this down to what's actually profitable. And I'm going to say this again and again, but a lot of times when you're diversified, it's hard to figure out which income stream is actually taking you in the right direction versus sucking equity back out of the operation and draining equity back out and actually taking us backwards, okay? So, when it comes to being diversified, a lot of people will throw around this phrase, well, when the crops are making money, or rather, when the crops are not making money right now, but that's kind of the case that we're in. When the row crops aren't making money, the cattle are making money, right? We're just raking it in on the cattle right now. Okay, well, what's the inverse of that? Well, 5 years ago, or even 4 years ago, when the cattle were not making money, well, then the row crops are hanging in there, right? And holding things up. So if you think of that, it's a really good balancing act, brings different income streams, like we mentioned before, on the positive side of things. Well, okay, if one of them is always losing money, one's always making money, are you just breaking even? That's ultimately my question, is are you just breaking even all the time and you're not necessarily going in the right direction? And so that's the thing, is it can be really hard to track those numbers, and really kind of comes back to maybe just being a little bit distracted. That's kind of my next point here, and being distracted as to which ones are actually where you need to spend your time and energy and your focus, and really hard to know which one's going to be driving you in the right direction. Now, another side note there is, I'd say a big one is going to be, say, the expertise. And in most cases, I'd say some people really have a really good expertise in, say, one area, and can really focus on that area and put their heart, soul, and that's what they truly enjoy. It's generally one area or the other. Maybe there's both. There's aspects of both that we like, but usually one or the other is where we're going to be focusing on. And it's going to be easily distracted if you got different income streams, different things going on, or different areas that kind of pull you to different areas, right? And I'd say in most cases, as an entrepreneur, as a visionary, as somebody that has shiny object syndrome, and I'm just like you that's listening to this. If you have shiny object syndrome, if you constantly see all these different opportunities that are out there and you want to just go chasing them all, right? You want to accomplish the world. You want to do all these things, right? You want to be the first. Also, I want to throw that out there because you always want to be the first. So we want to capture these different opportunities. Well, generally, those are the ones that are going to distract you. Those are the ones that are going to take away your focus from what your true primary focus needs to be, what the true cash cow actually is. No pun intended there. Not saying it's always the cows, even though right now the cows are really worth a lot of cash. But this is something to really kind of hone in on, is to where your focus actually needs to be. And so that's why I want to come back around, because we talked about diversification. Now, specialization is pretty much going to be the opposite of that. But let's talk about why operations will really get very specific as to what they're doing, hone in on, say, one or just even two different income streams and what that actually looks like. And now, before I talk about that, I mentioned one book already with Land Rich, Cash Poor by Brian Reisinger. Let's talk about a second book that I've got a lot of value from as well. And this one's going to be tied more to this specialization. And so that's why I want to mention this book. It's called Profit First by Mike Michalowicz. And the whole point of the book is not to talk about being very specialized, but the whole point that I want to bring up right now is a comment that he made when he was talking about something here, and it was called the survival trap. The survival trap basically meaning it's not necessarily about driving your vision wherever you're trying to go. It's all about taking action, any action to get yourself out of crisis. Okay, so this book is probably talking in general about just other businesses, right? Maybe not necessarily agriculture, but in most cases, and I can think back to when we were, say, going through our hardships back in, say, 2018, 2019, and we were looking at any different ways when you're going through a crisis to bring in income, right? To just drive any sort of income to really help your situation, to get you out of this crisis, this challenge, this hardship, this suck, right? So you're looking for all these different avenues, and it may not even be tied to your core thing that you're really good at. It might be tied to something completely, left field, out of the realm, right? And so all of a sudden you're searching for these ideas and you see them, right? As a visionary, as an entrepreneur, you see these different ideas out there. It's one of our assets and one of our downfalls. And so you're all of a sudden you're chasing shiny objects and you're going after them, and you're all of a sudden you're way off course, right? And you've got all of these different expertise that you need, all these different skills that you now need to focus on, all of these different, say, investments that you're all of a sudden making, all these different pieces of equipment that might be for this one specific thing. And so it just draws you to be really kind of diluted and really not focusing on the core thing. Now, rounding this back to being specialized, what does this actually look like when it comes to being specialized? And a real side note here, if you've got an issue like a health issue, right? Say it's something with your heart. Would you rather go to the hometown family doctor that specializes in all things cold, flus, ears, nose, and throat, head things, just everything, right? Would you rather go to them, or would you rather go to somebody that specializes in one area that's damn good at it and it's going to take care of it and it's going to be really good and ultimately hone in on that? Okay. Well, yeah, it's pretty obvious. You're going to want to go to somebody that's really good at what they do. And it's for that reason that those people generally make more money. They're worth it, right? And so they're really good at their job and they stick to their lane and they're really good at it. Okay. And so it's for that same reason. That's why people end up specializing. That's why people end up taking one, say, lane and sticking to it, say going to row crops or just sticking to that, because that's what they're good at. That's what their land base is for. That's what they're ultimately going to be the most profitable in. And it's easy to track and easy to come back and manage that. Okay. So kind of in that same regard, when it comes to being really specialized, honing on one thing, it helps us because we're really efficient and that's our expertise, right? We're probably going to have better profit margins because we can manage things better, and it's more simplified. It's less complicated with all these different areas and fingers that go off into many different directions, right? It's very simplified and easier to manage. And at that same regard, it's a lot easier to scale. It's a lot easier to get bigger because we have those different, say, systems and processes that are built out that are simple and easy, and it's a lot easier to scale. Now, a lot easier to track financially. Say we've got just crops all going through one account, all going through one QuickBooks. We can track things, lay things out a lot easier to see what the true profitability is, where we're actually going in the right direction, whether this is worth it or not. Are we being profitable? What do we need to sell our crops for so we can make a money here? And so that's why it's a lot easier to track when things are simple and very kind of honed in there, right? And so specialization doesn't always necessarily mean doing less, but it means going deeper, being smarter, and more intentional with what we're trying to do there. That's kind of the big one there. Now, kind of the negatives with specialization, basically going back to the positives of diversification, right? These are the inverse. This is the opposite. Well, with specialization, we got market fluctuations, weather issues, cash flow pressure, and, it's less flexible at times. And so that's kind of the big thing there that, want to hone in on as being specialized in everything that we're trying to do. Now, as we get to kind of thinking about this, the things that I see and kind of the big picture as you kind of make your conclusion as what's your operation actually look like? Are you currently diversified? And I'm sure to some extent, everybody is, unless you were strictly corn, soybeans, that's the way that we're doing things. No other outside income, no other things that we're going to be trying, closed off to new ideas, right? And those operations do exist. But in most cases, I feel like we're probably going to be doing something else, whether it's custom work or whether it's, trying different crops or whether we're using cover crops. Maybe we got some other avenues out there that really help us to diversify in some regard. Or maybe you're literally the operation that has 5 different entities started. You've got a trucking business, a custom business, you've got cow-calf operation, maybe you've got a row crop operation, maybe you've got hog barns that you have. All of these different areas, which can be a good thing. As I've mentioned, this can be a good thing, but at the same time causes you to maybe be a little bit distracted in the areas that you're trying to go down, okay? And so kind of want to bring this back home here is really what this comes down to, and the reason that I see these different issues that come up with being diversified, and I'm not trying to lean you, kind of persuade you one way or the other to this is what you should do versus that, but ultimately get you to think as to, in your operation, what has worked, what hasn't worked, what do you think is holding you back, what do you think you can grow, what do you think is actually, I said before, holding you back, but what's maybe sucking that equity back out of the operation and keeping you from actually growing in that regard, okay? So in order to do so, in order to track these numbers, we need to be very specific as to what we're trying to do, okay? So if you're going to be running a diversified operation with row crops and cow-calf and a feed yard and a custom business, and that works for you, great. But here's the thing you need to do. All right, listen up, because this is important. If you're going to do that and you're going to be intentional about this and you want to continue to, carry that on and being diversified and all the benefits that brings back to your operation, do yourself a favor right now. If you want to grow, if you want to continue to be better, be as efficient as possible and be as profitable as possible, you need to track your numbers at a high level, okay? So you need to be breaking that down. I'm not saying you necessarily need to create 5 different entities or entity for each different income stream, although that's not a bad idea. There's multiple different reasons to do that, but you at least need to be breaking this down. Maybe it's 2 sets of books. Maybe it's 2 different bank accounts. Maybe it's multiple sets of cash flows. Maybe it's breaking things down specifically to a tool that I use that I've actually created called an enterprise analysis. With an enterprise analysis, I've actually been able to break down, say, what's our profit and loss for the row crops, specifically each individual crop, and then what's, say, a profit and loss on the livestock, the cow-calf, the feeder cattle. What does that actually look like? We need to be treating, and furthermore, on, say, just even the industry or the enterprise, we say cattle, we say livestock. Furthermore, on, say, the cattle, is what's the true profitability on the cow-calf versus the backgrounding versus the finishing versus even, say, the direct-to-consumer. Break this down. Be as detailed as possible. I can guarantee you will not regret having more details to help you make more better informed decisions, okay? And so that's the big thing I want to hone in on, is you cannot manage what you do not measure. So let's start by measuring. Let's be very accurate, okay? Let's make sure we know exactly what the numbers actually look like, exactly which area is profitable. Maybe they're all profitable. Maybe one's just slightly less profitable. Maybe you need to just figure out exactly where you need to spend all your time and energy and devote your time and focus to that, right? Devote all your resources to this area versus the other. Now, the hard thing here that people might find out, and this is just me speaking freely, so take it for what it's worth, but you might actually come to find out by doing the hard work, by putting in the time and energy that'll ultimately pay you, sticking to the office, working on the business, not solely in the business, you might actually find out that the area that you think is profitable probably is less profitable than you think, or the area that you might truly enjoy is maybe the one that's actually sucking equity back out of the operation. What then? What are you going to do now? Okay. No, if you want to continue to do so, and as long as you know that this is an area that's not profitable, well then at the end of the day, that's your choice, right? There's a lot of areas, a lot of people that have done that thus far that, well, I'm probably not making a lot of money here, but I enjoy it, so we're going to keep doing it. Well, that's fine. As long as you can own that and stick with it, that's fine. But at the end of the day, if that's the case, you can't necessarily sit here and complain that you're not making all this money, right? Because if you haven't figured out exactly what's making money, you can't sit here and complain about that, okay? And so that's the big thing I want to hit home here as we round this out, is to do yourself a favor, be diligent, farm intentionally, and be more smarter with what you're trying to allocate your dollars towards, right? And so take the time to sit in the office, put the numbers, put pen to paper, and figure out what's what. Find a tool, find a system that works for you, that you can actually break things down and figure out what's profitable or what's actually sucking equity back out of the operation. And another side note there, that's exactly what I do with Pioneer Farmer and all the clients that I work with, is trying to figure out in a diversified operation or even in a specialized operation, what's truly profitable and what can we do to actually drive our operation in the right direction. A good tool that I utilize to do that is called an enterprise analysis spreadsheet. Hit me up if you want to learn more about that. I'd love to share how that's helped make decisions in our operation. But really, that's all I got for today. Kind of the take home here is to consider, what does your operation actually look like? Are you diversified? Are you specialized? Where do you think you should go in the future? What do you think is actually profitable? What's sucking equity back out? And where do you need to focus your time, energy, and your resources, right? And another side note there before we close this out, 2 books that I would highly recommend: Land Rich, Cash Poor by Brian Reisinger. Go listen to it or read it, whatever works best. Good one there. And Profit First. Not necessarily tied, either of these not necessarily tied back to diversifying or being specialized, but just also good resources, good books to go check out. So go look into those, go give them a listen. And really, that's all I got for this episode. And we'll catch you next time. Thanks for tagging along with me today as we sharpened our mindsets. If you've gained insight from today's episode, be sure to take a screenshot to share or send this episode to somebody who might also find value in it. For more, follow me on Instagram @GarrettRuskamp or on Facebook, and join me next time for more conviction through clarity.